All right, so in no particular order, I guess we're going to start by covering quotes. We'll talk about some of the cool things you can do with double quotation marks in PowerShell. I like to call them magic quotes. That's a word from a different programming language, but PowerShell's behavior is real similar. And that's going to lead us to SubExpressions. We'll talk about here strings, which are basically gigantic blocks of string. I'll show you a couple of good places where those are useful. We will get into PowerShell's escape character system. We'll talk about how to tell PowerShell what type of data you expect to be in a certain kind of variable or in a particular variable. And we'll talk about arrays, variables that contain more than one thing. And just to kind of round out the miscellaneous march, we'll get into some of the basic math operators as well. And this should line us up pretty good to talk about some of the more interesting things as we go forward. But don't skip over this nugget. These are actually really, really important little tricks. They're subtle. They're all based on punctuation marks. They're easy to miss, but man, they will save you a lot of time, or if you're not aware of them, they will take you hours to unwind if you get into trouble. Okay, PowerShell version 2, Windows 7. And again, this is one of those nuggets where we're going to pretty much spend most of our time right here because this stuff doesn't change drastically in later versions either. So let's begin, at the very beginning. A very good place to start with variables. That is a variable. The variable's name is var. Now, I got to say this several times. The variable's name is var. It is not $var. The $sign is never part of the variable name, and I'm going to make that very explicit in just a moment. This variable contains a string, which is hello. All variables are kept on the variable drive. So if we scroll through here, they're usually alphabetical. Let's see, we should find var, I guess at the beginning of, there we go, end of the list. So what do I mean by the $sign not being a part of the name? Well, there are some commands that are designed to work with variables, such as new variable. So pay real close attention here. The variable var contains the word hello, correct? You can see that right here. And you'll notice that the name here is not listed with a $sign because a $sign is not part of the variable's name. The $sign is what some programming languages would call a dereferencing operator. If you think of a variable, how should you think? Think of a variable as a box, okay? So we've got a box, and it's got the little flaps and everything that we open up. So the box is named var. When you refer to var, you're referring to the box. When you refer to $sign var, you're referring to what's inside the box. The $sign means go get whatever is inside this variable. So if you're referring to the variable itself, the container, that's not with a $sign. Anytime you use the $sign, you're going inside the thing. Okay? So that being the case, new variable, name, $sign var, value, goodbye. I want you to pause this for just a second and predict what I just did. Tell me what I just did. A lot of folks will say, well, you created the variable var and now it contains the value goodbye. No, $sign var contains the value hello. Right here, when I used the $sign, I dereferenced. I referred to what's inside var, which means I created a variable called hello, which contains the value goodbye. And if that doesn't make sense, I need you to pause this right now and stare at this screen until it does make sense, because all the information's right here. If I had wanted to create a new variable called var and give it the value goodbye, I would have done that. The name does not include the $sign. The $sign makes it go get what's inside the variable, and this will result in an error. I can't create a variable named var because a variable named var already exists. And that's what I would expect to happen because I had already created that thing, okay? So variable names can, well, there's two ways to think of this. Variable names can contain letters, numbers, underscores. That's what you really want them to contain. Okay, that variable now contains the number 5. Fun, good, excellent. Unfortunately, and if we look at the variable drive, ooh, there it is. So look at what I did there with the syntax. A variable name can contain anything except curly brackets when the name is in between curly brackets. I do not like this. I do not think this is a good approach. I think it makes the code harder to read. Other people disagree, and they will use this. So it's important that when you see it, you know what's happening. But now anytime you want to refer to that variable, that's how you're going to have to do it. And you'll notice that version 2 of PowerShell is not going to, I'm hitting the tab key. Nothing's happening. Version 2 of PowerShell is not going to tab complete that for me. So I'm going to have to type that whole ugly, awesome thing. Okay. Let's put a couple of interesting things together. Just making sure that equals hello. A equals, say, $var. B equals, say, $var. Only difference between those two lines is that the first one, where I set the variable A, uses double quotation marks, and the second one uses single quotation marks. Here's the second one. Single quotation marks don't do anything with anything inside. They just take everything as a literal string. Double quotes, on the other hand, look for a $, and they will assume that everything after the $, up to the first character that is not a legal variable name character, is a variable name, and they will replace it. So let's do this again. So a space is not a legal character for a normal variable name, so that should just replace $var with the contents of $var. Check this out. That is a backtick, grave accent mark. It is PowerShell's escape character. It takes away any special meaning of the character that immediately follows the backtick. In some cases, where a character does not already have a special meaning, it gives it a special meaning. Backtick N is a carriage return line feed, so new line character. So backtick either takes away the special meaning for a character like a $, that means something to PowerShell, or it adds a special meaning to a character that normally doesn't mean anything special to PowerShell. You can see this in a lot of places. If I said CD program files and I hit tab, PowerShell is going to put that in quotation marks because it contains a space. If I just hit enter here, it's going to break because it's taking this as one parameter value and this as another parameter value. And that's what the quotes were fixing. But I can also escape that space. And now it takes the space as a literal character, not as a separator. So that's escapes. Escapes are only monitored inside double quotation marks. They're not monitored inside single quotation marks. See, everything is literal inside single quotation marks. So kind of the best practice is to use single quotation marks around your strings unless you explicitly need that double quotation mark variable replacement trick. Let's talk about arrays. $S now contains the output of the get service command. So if I look at $S, there we go, it's all the services. This is an array or a collection. Now in most programming languages there is a difference between an array and a collection. In PowerShell kind of muddies the line a little bit. They're not technically interchangeable, but for all intents and purposes, a collection and an array do much the same thing here. So I'm going to take this and refer to the first item, the second item, and you'll notice that I can refer to any of these columns individually by adding a period and the column name. So that gets me the name of the second service. Double quotation marks S0 dot name. Now remember, in double quotation marks, come back here, PowerShell looks for the $, and it replaces it with the contents of the variable. and it only looks up into the first character that is not a legal character for variable names. So I want you to try and predict what this is going to do. Let's take a look. I bet that's not what you expected. $S is taken as the variable. This is not a legal character for a variable name, and so PowerShell stops here. And it tries to display the contents of S, but in PowerShell version 2, all it's doing is telling me, hey, what's in there is a system.serviceProcess.service controller. And here's the next one. And if we go all the way to the end of this, oops, there's the square bracket 0 square bracket dot name. So when you're doing this double quotation mark replacement trick, you can only do it with variables, but you can also do something called a sub-expression. A sub-expression works in double quotation marks. It starts with a $sign and has 2 parentheses, open and close. Everything inside the parenthesis is taken as executable code. PowerShell will execute that, and it will replace the entire sub-expression with the results of whatever it executed. So now we get the first service's name because that's what went into the sub-expression. Kind of one of the points of this is if you've ever worked in a scripting language where you had to concatenate a bunch of strings together, you know, query equals like that type of thing, you don't have to do that with PowerShell. All you have to do is put the variables and everything inside double quotation marks, and PowerShell will fill them in for you. That's a tremendously useful trick, and it makes your code a lot easier to read. By the way, plus is the operator for string concatenation. It's also the operator for addition, like 5 plus 5. There's also 10 minus 5, 10 times 10, 10 divided by 5. So those are all your core math operators: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. You can also use parentheses, just like you would in any math expression. So strings are delimited by single or double quotation marks. And normally, you've got a couple of ways you can work with these things. Does var still contain hello? Yes, okay. So let's take A. What you've seen there is PowerShell's extended prompt mode. I had opened a double quotation mark and then hit enter. Now it knew I couldn't possibly be done because it had not seen the closing double quotation mark. A lot of folks will discover this feature by accident when they accidentally hit enter in the middle of a string. But what PowerShell has done here is it has actually preserved those carriage returns. So if I look at A, it was a double quoted string, so it did replace $var with its contents, but it preserved all of those quotation marks. There's kind of another technique around this, one that's a little bit more formal, and you'll typically see it more in scripts, called a here string. So since you typically see this in scripts, I'm going to open up the ISE. Oops. And that's kind of what a here string looks like. You open it with @ double quote or @ single quote. And again, if you use double quotes, then you get to take advantage of the variable replacement trick. And you close it with quote @ but it's important that the closing quote @ be at the very, very beginning of the line. Watch what happens to the color coding when I hit this. See, it's all gone wacky because the ISE no longer recognizes that as an appropriate structure. This closing thing has got to be at the end and pretty much on a line by itself. I mean, it's the way you would normally do it. So let's just run this real quick, and I'm going to have it print out message. And the way I'm going to do that is to copy this to the clipboard, and I'm actually going to paste it right into the shell. So it's real similar. This is a little bit more of a lenient approach. When you use a here string like this, everything inside the here string is taken as part of the string. So you don't have to escape a lot of different characters and stuff. Plus, if you're using double quotation marks, you get to take advantage of variable replacement and sub-expressions. You'll see this a lot when people need to put a big block of stuff. You know, for example, I've seen folks who wanted to create a little HTML string. And so they'll just start building this up, and they'll make it real pretty, and they'll use all their indentation and stuff like that. And PowerShell won't care. It'll just take it all as one gigantic string. So that's a kind of a useful feature. Let's talk about how variables can twist around on you and kill you. I think most people would probably agree that A contains an integer, 5, a number, a whole number, integer. B contains a string. Now, you can see how the number 5 is also a string. I mean, it's a character, but in this case, because I did not enclose it in quotation marks, PowerShell should be taking it as a number. So what if I do this? What's the result? It's 10. Or 55. You see, when you're using the plus operator, because it does both concatenation and addition, PowerShell has to decide which one of those you mean. And so when you put an integer first, $A, it takes the plus sign to be addition. Now B is a string, but it's also a digit. And so PowerShell just goes ahead and kind of coerces it and treats it as a digit and does the math. 5 plus 5 is 10. When you put B, a string first, plus is used for concatenation. So it's not adding B and A, it's concatenating them. And yeah, A is a digit, but it's also a character, so it treats it as a string. And the answer here isn't 55, it's 5 concatenated to 5. You can see how this could get you in a lot of trouble. For example, read host is a command that we can use to prompt for input from the command line. So let's say you were writing a script and you put this in there and you wanted the user who was running this to enter a number so that you knew how many times to repeat some particular operation. Hopefully you can see now where you're going to have a problem later in your script because you're going to treat the contents of $repeat as a number, but it's really a string. It's probably going to result in an error, and it's going to be an error in an odd place where you're probably not expecting it. Now PowerShell does give you a way around this. Let's pull that whole thing back up. And I'm going to tell PowerShell that repeat is only allowed to contain integers. Oops. This goes before the $sign. And I got an error right there, which is exactly where I wanted the error, because that's the point where an error, a mistake, was actually made. If I run this again and put a number in, then I get a number out. So once you put a number, or you declare this as a number, you've told PowerShell only let this be an integer, you can never put a string in there unless you explicitly redeclare it. And PowerShell will let you do that. So my recommendation is anytime you're using a variable, consider putting the correct data type on the front of it. Int and string are two common ones. There's also float, which is for numbers with a fractional percentage. You can also use single or double if you want to specify the amount of accuracy or precision that your floating point number has. Those are very common. There's also Boolean, and that accepts the values true or false, which PowerShell represents with $true and $false. You would also see those in the variable drive. There's true, false would be a little bit further up in the list. So string, int, single, double, float, bool, those are the two you're going to use, or the set you're going to use most commonly to declare your variable types. There are definitely others, and you're going to encounter them kind of as we use them in context in upcoming nuggets. So a lot of information about variables. Keep watching. We're going to switch over now to PowerShell version 3. All of those same things are true in version 3, by the way. You get here strings and variable replacement and all that cool stuff. The one thing that you also get is a little tab completion action on those variables. So that's kind of nice to have. There's also a new, let's be generous and call it a feature in PowerShell version 3. Remember I did this, I did the whole get service trick, and then I took a variable and in double quotes I put S. And you remember under version 2 it printed system.serviceprocess.servicecontroller over and over and over and over and over. Well, PowerShell version 3 won't do that. When you refer to a collection like that, it knows that you want something, and so what it implicitly does is this. Instead of replacing it with the type name, which is what service.service_process or system.service_process.service_controller was, it goes and tries to grab the name information for whatever's in that variable. And that's because most of the objects, most of the data produced by PowerShell commands, most of them have a name. So if you have to just pick something by default, name is a safe one because almost everything does have a name, and the name is usually human readable, so it's useful. But that's kind of what that's doing. Instead of doing the ugly thing, in fact, I'll flip back to version 2 just so you can see the difference. $s equals get service, $var equals $s. Look at $var. See, it did that. Whereas in 3, that exact same command gave me the names. So just be aware that that's happening. It can be a little tricky for some folks, especially if you're starting in version 3, because you'll do this and you'll be like, oh, well, that's nice behavior. And then you'll run your script or whatever on version 2, and it will do something entirely different and way less useful because you didn't realize PowerShell is actually doing something tricky under the hood to make this nice. And the older version of PowerShell isn't doing the nice thing under the hood. So those are really the only two additions and difference between V2 and V3 as far as this topic goes. One more thing to show you, and that's a hash table. Now these can look a little bit ugly, but I'm just going to try and keep a really simple one. A hash table starts as an @ sign with 2 curly brackets. Inside here, I'm going to put a series of key value pairs. So that is a single key value pair. The first thing is a key, then there's an equal sign, and then there's a value. The key is what we're going to use to refer to this thing, and then the value is what we get when we refer to it. This is sometimes called an associative array because it allows you to associate two things, a key and a value. Sometimes they're actually called dictionaries as well, because if you treat the key as a word, then the value becomes the definition for that. So I'm going to put all of this into a variable. And if I look at that variable, you can see that it breaks down the keys and the values. If I ask for ht key, it gives me the value. If I ask for ht word, it gives me my definition. And so that's how those come together. We're not going to use these a lot immediately. Come about nugget number 12 in this series, though, we're going to start using this hash table structure, and so I wanted you to get used to it right now. So just to kind of re-emphasize what's going on in this thing, we've got a pair, and another pair, and another pair, and they're all separated by semicolons. Within each pair, I get a key and a value. So key and a value, key and a value. PowerShell lets you use these in much the way I have here to create a kind of lookup array, but it also uses these structures with several different commands to do a lot of really, really neat stuff. I think you're going to appreciate it when we get there, so just kind of remember that we covered this, and then when we get there, it'll be a piece of cake. All right, so now you know the difference between single and double quotes, and you know that the reason you use double quotes is to use all the cool tricks, such as being able to use escape characters, sub-expressions, and thunking variables down into a string. You learned how to use here strings, and the double and single quote trick applies to those as well. Just remember that. Talked about how to assign a type to a specific variable so that you know what's going in there and you know what type of data is in there. Looked at how to work with arrays, and we looked at some of the basic math operators. This should be pretty much most of the basic stuff, the stuff that sometimes I put off till later in the class. But you know, right now, there's a good time to cover these. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.